Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donny, and tonight we are discussing Genesis 1. We will be doing opening statements, roughly 20 minutes, and then we are going to have an informal discussion. We're also going to get you guys in the audience involved. We are going to make this very interactive, so make sure you're tagging me with your questions. Let's make sure they are on topic, and make sure you're tagging me at Standing for Truth. That way I don't miss your questions. So this debate's going to be epic. This debate is very important. And we've got two seasoned debaters here as well, Tyler Vela and CJ Cox. Gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us your time for this important debate.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. My privilege to host you guys on this important debate. So why don't we kind of get to know you guys a little bit, break the ice before we actually get into it and into the opening statements. Tyler, this is your first time debating on this platform and being on this show. So again, thank you so much for giving us your time. And I kind of want to hand it over to you, a little bit about yourself, what's going on over at your channel, and how you been.
Hi, I appreciate being here, and your audience will probably get sick of me. I think you have me on 3 times this month. So, you know, you're bringing me on and with a lot of confidence to get some content for you. I'm the host of the Freed Thinker. It's a podcast, blog, and YouTube channel. Started out as apologetics for the most part, but as I went through, I'm working on my master's degree at Reformed Theology, Reformed Theological Seminary. It started turning into kind of a systematic theology and whatever I was working on. So there's lots of content dealing with Reformed theology and Molinism and some other topics that are seasoned in there, some biblical theology and some aspects, like I did a whole series on Genesis, which is why I crossed paths with you for this. So the YouTube channel, though, as I've kind of segmented the ministry, so the YouTube channel is really dedicated to apologetics, mostly dealing with atheism and naturalism. I don't do anything with the cults, or I leave that to smarter people who have actually studied that. The podcast is more kind of the in-house debates with Molinism and freedom of the will and Reformed theology and all that kind of stuff. So that's me.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. And yes, you're right. We've got you on for another couple debates. Here's one that I've got the thumbnail ready to go. You and Joshua Gibbs will be discussing total inability and those things related to it, soteriology, regeneration, things like that. You'll also be debating A.K. Richardson on Romans 9 as well. So 2022 is exciting. We got a lot of great debates. So anyone in the audience, please, if you're not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button and share around this content, as the truth and critical thinking is important. CJ, thank you again for being back for this important discussion. How you been? A little bit about yourself, and if people were to go check out your channel, what should they expect to find?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here. So a couple things for those who don't know, I am CJ Cox. I run the YouTube channel, The Synagogue. Technically run 2 YouTube channels under that title, one, The Synagogue News, but it's not relevant for what we're talking about today, where I try to do Christian apologetics from a fundamentalist, explicitly fundamentalist, but also intellectual perspective, right? I try to take back, if you will, the term fundamentalism. I don't think it's a bad word. I think it's just an accurate word. In fact, even though we disagree on the subject today, I think it largely describes my opponent, if you're taking it the way that I take it, which is dictionary definition. And so I try to take that kind of back, and also, bring back the intellectual nature of fundamentalism, because back when this was originally becoming a thing, it came out of Princeton University and other areas like that, right? So the idea that fundamentalists are contrary to intellectualism is actually a very modern kind of thing. And so that's kind of the whole shtick that I have there. To get some specifics, I tend to be non-denominational, literal, reformed, and I like to talk a lot about history and philosophy. We're going to do a bunch of stuff on the history of the holidays on my channel this year. But nonetheless, that's kind of my whole thing, and I appreciate you guys having me here today.
Awesome. I appreciate that. CJ, thank you, brothers, for the introductions. To the audience, if you like what you see from Tyler and CJ, please check the description box of this video. I've got their websites, channels, and so on linked, so people can go and check it out and subscribe. So again, tonight we are discussing Genesis 1. and we are going to make it interactive. I already see some questions and comments and super chats flying in, so I will be moderating and gathering questions. So again, please just make sure you're tagging me so I don't miss it. And we're just gonna get right into it. We've got 20-minute opening statements so we can understand both debaters' positions on this. And we agreed that Tyler would go first. And so, Tyler, whenever you're ready, let me know, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so much. And CJ, I have to admit, I'd be not using any of my time, but yes, capital F fundamentalist would describe me, the kind of lowercase sociological use of the term, which I think you're combating. So I appreciate that, your ministry for that very much. So with that, okay, on to the opening statement. The question here before us today is about the proper exegesis and interpretation of Genesis 1. This is a hermeneutical question. This is not a scientific question. That distinction is vitally important as it will distinguish my view from other views and will make the discussion different than the typical young earth versus old earth debate. Here, our only concern is about what the exegetes call the sensus literalis, or the sense of the literature, or more colloquially, the authorial intent. That is, what would the original author of Genesis 1 have intended the original audience to understand from the text? Now here, I must admit one assumption that I'm making, that if you don't accept it, will make charitably following my case very difficult. That assumption is that while I wholeheartedly agree that the Bible is inspired by God, every word, every jot and tittle, I take it to be a fact that a robust doctrine of inspiration is in concert with the human authors writing to a human audience from their own Sitzenleben, their own situation in life, such that it is not generally the case that the human authors would be unaware of what they were intending for their words to mean and how they should be understood. Now, this debate is normally held within the context of the dispute between two what are called concordist views. That is, two positions which equally view Genesis 1 as telling us in a more or less literal manner about the material origins and scientific or natural processes by which God created, formed, and filled his good creation. This dispute is overshadowed by the broader disagreement between Christian concordist views, all manners of creationists, and more atheistic or naturalistic concordist views, which seek to show that if the Bible is to be taken in a concordant sense, that it is in conflict with current scientific knowledge and therefore false. For better or worse, these two debates between broadly concordist and scientific or quasi-scientific views have so dominated the discussion that alternative views are typically seen as automatically out of bounds because they just do not answer the same kinds of questions or look at the scripture with the same lens. So here I am going to present such a view, but want to continue to remind my opponent and the audience that my view is not another species of concordism. It's another category altogether that thus seeks to ask a different kind of question. And no, that's not an allegorical one. In its most simple form, my view is that Genesis 1 uses a standard solar week as a literary framework on which to hang a polemical temple text used to simultaneously exalt God as the one and only creator while satirizing and dismissing the cultic deities of the surrounding nations, the Egyptian and broader Mesopotamian myths. Here, I will very briefly sketch out why I came to believe that the concordist views are lacking in explanatory value and why I think something like my view is more plausible. That is, I will make a negative and a positive case for my view. First, the negative case. I will not have space to bear this out in its entirety, but in studying the literature of Genesis 1, I began to find a discord between the largely late modern, Western, American evangelical readings of Genesis 1, to which I was regularly exposed to in church, and what extensive study about the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds, coupled with a strong historical grammatical hermeneutical methodology, were showing me about how to understand the Bible. This led me to further research and question many of the assumptions and arguments put forth by both young and old earth creationists, and more recently by theistic evolutionists. The more I studied, the more problems I found with how all of these views handled the text and the arguments that they commonly make to support their views. So for example, many young earthers will make claims that any time the Hebrew text says the word yom or day, and it's coupled with either an ordinal or a cardinal number, that it always refers to a literal 24-hour day. This is just easily defeated within the Bible itself, where we find numerous exceptions, such as Zechariah 14:7-9, Deuteronomy 10:10, Isaiah 9:14, and Hosea 6:2, where yom plus an ordinal or cardinal simply cannot mean a literal 24-hour day. Or they claim that the syntax of Genesis 1 and its use of what's called the vav consecutive construction, where the vav conjunctive is used with an imperfect verb, usually translated as, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, that somehow the presence of the vav consecutive in Genesis 1 proves that it's a historical narrative. Now, for anyone who knows Hebrew, that's just a bizarre assertion, since the vav consecutive, while is a major feature to move the plot of a narrative along, is commonly used in parables, like Jotham's parable of the trees and the bramble bush in Judges 9, or Nathan's parable against David in 2 Samuel 12, or epic songs like Moses' Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, or David's Song of Praise in 2 Samuel 22. And it even shows up repeatedly in the Psalms. It's used 47 times in Psalm 18 alone. Sometimes it even refers to a potential future action that hasn't even happened yet, such as in Exodus 22:26. It is non-controversial that the vav consecutive moves conceptual action forward narratively. But it's just absurd as a claim to say that that proves a text in which it is found must be read as a historical narrative. It's just exegetically nonsense. Or we're told that wherever evening and morning appear with a numeral and yom, it always means a 24-hour day. Here, the problem is just that that's an ad hoc rule. It's not actually derived from any Hebrew normative grammatical structure. Why do I say that? Because so far as we can tell, Genesis 1 is the only text that even meets that overstated rule. There's no other text that even has the qualification of having all three of those features in immediate conjunction with each other. So how can we know it always means a literal 24-hour day if the only passage that it happens is in Genesis 1? And so you can't argue for the literal view of a 24-hour day in Genesis 1 without patently begging the question of their own view to say that. In addition, we seem to have clear exceptions to that rule. The seventh day is plausibly not a solar day and is actually endured through to the life and ministry of Christ, where Jesus says that his Father is still working on the Sabbath day, and that's why he, the Lord of the Sabbath, can also work on the calendar Sabbath day. So if the Sabbath rest in Genesis 1 was not ongoing, at least to that time, then the logic of Jesus' argument would collapse. Other claims about statements in Exodus 20 that God created in 6 days, or that Jesus said that God made Adam and Eve from the beginning, they just all seem to collapse in the same way as these other ones on even the most basic of exegetical scrutiny. So young earth creationism seems to thrive on these arguments, but they're just really terrible arguments. And let me not merely pick on young earth creationists, because remember, I'm just not a concordist. Attempts by old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists to do things like shoehorn a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, or to read Yom as millions or even billions of years for each day, just because Yom sometimes can mean a nondescript period of time, are just so exegetically exotic in their treatment of the grammar and the syntax, and so foreign to the ancient Near Eastern Sitzenleben, even more so than the young earth, that I'm just honestly baffled how anyone takes those views seriously as exegetical treatments of the text. And add in the focus on demonstrating the earth is young or old from quasi-scientific claims, from flood geology and variegated speeds of light, and all the gymnastics that creationists often use to talk about fossils and geological columns and the hydronic cycle, and shoving that all back into an ancient Near Eastern text. It's just hard to imagine a more convoluted way to go about interpreting that ancient text. So I found that concordist views are just wildly unconvincing. But what did that leave me with? Well, I spend about 20 hours on my YouTube channel and even more on the podcast and tons of articles and blogs and made my major research paper going over this for reasons why holding the view I now have. And I now have about, 10 more minutes to lay it all out. So allow me to quickly sketch what the view is and why we ought to prefer it. First, there are numerous reasons argued for by scholars such as Walton, Wenham, Steinem, Kidner, Hamilton, Sarna, Longman, Currid, Westerman, and many others for the view that the ancient Near Eastern Israelite, regardless of if we think the author was Moses or someone in the Mosaic community like Joshua or Caleb, or that it's even a pre or even a post-exilic priest redacting together the final form of the received text, it doesn't matter. They would not have thought about the world in terms of material ontology. That is, they simply would not have had the categories to even think about the world and its creation in terms familiar to us in our modern context about scientific or material formation of objects. They would have thought of their world in functional and cultic ways. Things existed for them when or because they had a function or they served a cosmic religious significance, not because they extended in space and time. This means that non-scientific, non-concordist readings of the origin texts are simply intrinsically more probable because they're in line with the worldview and the Sitz and Leben of the original author and audience. Second, we see major textual, structural, and thematic borrowing from various other creation accounts that would have been known to the educated author of the text to show that the cosmos is not a mere natural creation, but is a realm where God rules and reigns from his garden temple. For example, we see a heptadic or a sevenfold structure throughout the entire text, which is also ubiquitous throughout ancient Near Eastern temple texts. So much so that Old Testament scholar Loren Fisher writes, quote, "One must speak of ordering the cosmos in terms of seven, even as the construction of the microcosm must be according to the sacred number," end quote. We see in the Baal epic that the building of the temple to Baal is tied to creation, and it took 6 days to complete, in which a fire burned for 6 days, and the fire was extinguished on the seventh day as Baal takes his throne and rests in the sanctuary. Something exactly paralleled in Exodus 35:5, where the Israelites were commanded to not have a fire burning on the seventh day, immediately before being given instruction for constructing the tabernacle. We can see the heptadic structure in more robust ways when we look at the grammar. Verse 1:1 has 7 words. 1:2 has 14 words. Significant words like God, earth, water, and heaven occur in multiples of 7. It was so, or it was good, both occur in multiples of 7. And by the way, that doesn't occur artifactually to the number of days, since the formula is actually missing from day 2, but appears twice in day 3, apparently to shore up the need for it to be there 7 times. Light and day appear 7 times in the first paragraph, 7 references to light in the 4th paragraph. The whole narrative follows an entire heptadic structure of 7 sections. Chapter 2, verse 13 refers to the 7th day 3 times in 3 sentences, each of which is composed of 7 words. The paragraph about the 7th day is composed of 35 words, a multiple of 7. The same pattern appears throughout Genesis 2:3, but in a far less tightly textual manner, showing a progression out of a temple text and into a more classical but still highly stylized literary prose. Exodus 24:15-16, which is description of a temple, has the heptadic structure as well for the construction of the tabernacle. The priests were consecrated over the 7-day period of time in Exodus 29. The 7 days of Genesis are paired with the 7 speeches of Moses in Exodus 25-34. Outside of the heptadic similarities, we see strong verbal similarities between Genesis 1 and the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus 39-40, showing that Genesis 1 is about the construction of a temple. In both, we see that all the work, and it was good. All the work is completed as it was stated. God or Moses finish their work expressly. God or Moses declare blessing over their work. God or Moses sanctify their work. God or Moses rest from their work at the end. Both follow a forming and a filling structure. The Levites and Adam are both said to avad and shamar, to tend and to keep, or more literally, to serve and keep watch over their respective temples. We see further common themes of ancient Near Eastern creational temple texts in which they were garden temples surrounded by water, out of which the life of the world flowed. They're connected with life and fertility, with wisdom. They're built on divine speech act, and are often associated with the rule, enthronement, and kingship of the god for which they're built. As stated above, they're usually inaugurated with some type of heptatic or 7-day ceremony, and often are seen as a cosmic battle of overcoming the powers of chaos, something which we often ignore, but is expressly said about creation in Psalm 29 and Psalm 93, where God fights and subdues the surging seas, crushes the pagan god Rahav, and displays the power of his mighty right hand, a polemic against the kings of the nations, specifically Egypt, which we'll get to in a moment. This concept of a temple of rest post-creation is also found in the Ugarit and Babylonian creation accounts of El as well. By the way, these all predate even the most conservative dating of the book of Genesis. Now, I'm not going to have time to explore it here, but there's major structural and thematic and lexical parallels between Genesis 1 and these earlier texts from the Memphite Shabaka stone, the Gudea cylinders, the Enuma Elish, and others. But what about the polemics? Because I said my view is polemical as well. Polemical theology in the Bible is when the biblical author wholesale borrows or alludes to the idioms, imagery, and thought forms of the broader culture and religious beliefs around them, but with subtle or sometimes not so subtle shifts to give them new meaning, often to elevate Yahweh or to satirize the gods of the nation. A clear example of this in the Old Testament polemics is in its historical setting is the use, as I mentioned, of the outstretched arm or strong hand of Yahweh. We're told in Exodus 6:6 that it's by Yahweh's outstretched arm that he'll accomplish the mighty acts of judgment and will redeem the children of Abraham in Egypt. In Exodus 32:11 and Deuteronomy 6:21, we're told that the Lord overthrew Pharaoh and defeated the powers of Egypt by his mighty hand. These descriptions of the mighty hand and an outstretched arm are stated together in Deuteronomy 7:19 and 26:8 and blended together in Exodus 15:12 and 16. These two terms, however, did not arise in Israelite culture. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom period, around 2030 to 1640, these became established terms to describe Pharaoh. In a hymn to Senusret I in about 1965 to 1920 BCE, we read, quote, "Moreover, he is a mighty man who achieves with his strong arm a champion without equal," end quote. Possibly more relevant to the context of early dating for the composition of Genesis is a statement by Tutmosis II in 1492 to 1479 BCE during the Hyksos period, where Tutmosis II describes himself as, quote, "great in power and mighty in arm." I have about a dozen more of these that I'll just have to skip through. So when the author of Exodus writes after the plagues as a conflict sequence between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, specifically Pharaoh, the incarnation of Ra, that Yahweh delivered his people by his mighty and outstretched arm, as was clearly showing that it was Yahweh, not Pharaoh, that controls the peace and destiny of the nations. This point was not lost on Jethro, who proclaimed in Exodus 18:10 through 11, quote, "Praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly." So too, in Genesis 1, we see polemical satire throughout, where God shows that he's the only creator by his simple word of power. The sun and the moons aren't deities. They're just greater and lesser lights. They're simply luminaries. The animals aren't mystical. They're given to humans. Humans were created in the image of God, not as menial servants to feed and to serve and sexually stimulate the gods. A huge statement, considering that in pretty much all other creation accounts, humans are made as basically menial slaves to serve the gods who need them to feed them, for example. Now, we also see lexical similarities where words are wholesale taken from various cognate languages and brought into the Hebrew text. We see the thematic parallels, like those mentioned above, and many others. We can talk about the four primal elements of the Egyptian pre-creation scheme that neatly parallel the four Genesis narrative elements. Johnston, for example, lays this out in his article. In the Hebrew, we have empty and formless, darkness, watery deep, and the spirit and the wind of God. These are all the pre-creation powers. In Egyptian, you have the boundless indifferentiation, the infinite darkness, the primordial waters, and the divine wind of the creator God. These are all exactly paralleled. In addition, we can see structural parallels between Genesis 1 and the earlier Shabaka stone. For example, if I were to describe this, there's a pre-creation condition that's just lifeless chaos over the watery deep. The breath of the God moves over the waters. The word creates the light first, and then a primordial hill emerges from amidst the waters. There's a procreation, a separation of the sky when none was raised over the earth. There's the formation of the heavenly ocean by the separation. That formation creates the dry ground below. The sun is then created to rule in the image of the gods. The earth sprouts plants, fish, birds, reptiles, and land animals. And then creation of God's statues, cultic cities, and food offerings, and so people. And then the God completely completes his activity and rests. Now, what did I describe? That's really, really close to the later Genesis texts, but that's the Memphis Shabaka stone. Now, I could go on and on and on, but I'm almost out of time. So while this is mostly a superficial summary of the view, and I would encourage anyone to go check out my page on this, I think that's a sufficient place to start our discussion about Genesis 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler, for your opening statement. 20 minutes really does fly by because we've got a ton of questions coming in already. And I looked over and I said, wow, almost 20 minutes. So here we go. Very clear and concise. Well done. Definitely going to be an interesting discussion. And we've already got a solid mix of questions where people would be in agreement with what you said. So this is going to be great. CJ, we're now going to hand it over to you. You have 20 minutes for your opening statement. And before you get going, though, to the audience, make sure you are tagging me with your questions. And as I pointed out earlier, I've already got several good ones. So, CJ, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours, and you got 20 minutes.
All righty, thank you. So I don't know if I'll take the full 20 minutes, but then again, sometimes I end up kind of just letting my mouth get away from me. So we'll see what ends up happening here today. Just want to say first and foremost, shalom to all the saints and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I'd like to thank Standing for Truth and the SFT audience, excuse me, for setting this up and listening respectfully, as well as Mr. Vela for participating in the conversation with me today, because this is definitely a very good conversation for us to have. The discussion topic for tonight is Genesis 1 and concordism. So to quote the Dictionary of Christianity and Science, concordism refers to the position that the teachings of the Bible on the natural world, properly interpreted, will agree with the teaching of science when it properly understands the data and may in fact supplement science. The concordance not only believes that nature and scripture will harmonize, but sees specific references in the Bible to current scientific understanding of the universe. The concordist, then looks for those close parallels in order to show that scripture concords with or agrees with scientific conclusions, which is indeed the definition of concords would be agrees with. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're obviously only asking the question of whether or not Genesis 1 is concordist, not necessarily the Bible. Though I am more than sure that those other texts will probably have to come up for clarification purposes, they aren't the actual subject of the debate. So in other words, is the biblical creation narrative communicating historical and scientific facts, emphasis on scientific, not so much historical? Before we ask that question, I would like to answer a different question that I think is incredibly vital to our interpretation today, and it is indeed about interpreting the Bible and any other text for that matter, and how we are supposed to do it. I would argue that the best way to interpret the scriptures, and indeed any other text that we have in front of us, is to interpret them literally, or in other words, in its plain reading, unless context within the text indicates that we should interpret the text otherwise. This method of hermeneutics and interpretation has been variously called literalism, prima facie, sensus literalis, and in the ancient Israelite understanding, pishat. Pishat is a Hebrew word meaning straight, and this is the most common rabbinical method of interpreting these scriptures. Very common when discussing this, actually, there is a quote that they typically like to use from the Babylonian Talmud, specifically the Shabbat tractate, which says, quote, a text cannot be taken from the meaning of its pishat or original intention. Again, a text cannot be taken for, its plain reading, not original intention. That's a different word. Sorry, getting my lines here mixed up. Text cannot be taken from the original meaning or its pishat, right? And again, that is from the Shabbat tractate. In other words, it is understood in the Second Temple period when Jesus and the apostles lived, and in most Judaism subsequently, such as Orthodox Judaism, Modern Orthodox, and Haredi both, Karaite Judaism, Messianic Judaism, so on and so forth, that a verse can be understood in ways that are not necessarily the Pishat, but they cannot be understood in ways which are contradictory to the Peshat. Okay? So in other words, we can have something that is understood in a way that is less than plain, but not if it contradicts our understanding as it is read in the plain way, right? When the Protestant Reformation hits the scene, we get the same hermeneutic. We've actually already heard it addressed today. It's called the sensus literalis. The sensus literalis is defined by Dr. Robert Muller as, quote, literal sense, the fundamental literal or grammatical sense of the text of Scripture, distinguished into the sensus literalis simplex, the simple literal sense, which lies immediately in the grammar and the meaning of individual words, and the sensus literalis compositus, the constructed or compounded literal sense, which is inferred from the Scripture as a whole or from individual clear and therefore normative passages of Scripture when the simple literal sense of the text is in question, because it seems to either violate the articuli fidei, which is the fundamental articles, or the, and I'm going to say this one wrong, I'm sorry about that, praecepta cariatis, which is the precepts of love. That's the end of the quote. So it is important for us to note that neither the rabbis or the reformers took what we would today call a wooden literal reading of the Bible. After all, the Peshat of a poem or a psalm or a hymn is often, paradoxically, allegorical by its very definition. Rather, they sought to understand the text plainly, meaning as any reasonable person would read it without outside influence or context. And there is an incredibly important reason why they decided to interpret the text this way, and why I think we should decide to interpret the text this way. And that is that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant, incomparable word of the real living God, and it is for all peoples, in all places, at all times. In other words, the text is as much for a peasant farmer from 13th century Europe as it is for a Jewish shepherd from 800 BC, or as it is for an American PhD scholar or evangelical apologist like myself or Mr. Fellow. In other words, the text is not to be understood as any other text. If we were discussing the Enuma Elish today, then perhaps things like the historical context and the certain practices that might be going on in the Sumerian kingdom and things like that could be incredibly important, in fact, vitally important, in fact, definitional in our understanding of the text. But we are not talking about the Enuma Elish. We are talking about the inspired Theonoustos word of the living God Jehovah, which is for all peoples at all places at all times, most of which don't even know what the word universe means if you talk about throughout all of history, right? If we understand this text in any way, which would cause those before us to have their plain reading, let me rephrase that. If we are to understand this text in any way that causes those before us to be universally wrong when reading in a plain fashion, then we must acknowledge that our reading is in fact inaccurate, because that is not what this text is for. Now you might say, but there's certain things that we just didn't understand. Like, for example, what about the whole thing about the cherubims being outside of the what would you call that? Holy of Holies, excuse me. And, there's the Egyptian context there where you have an idol inside the Holy of Holies, and then you have the two divine beings kind of blocking it off, right? And whenever somebody would go there, they'd present their little sacrifice in front of the altar. And we have all the context now, so we know how awesome it was when somebody goes before the altar and there's no idol there. Isn't that all really cool? Yeah, it's all fantastic, but you don't need to know the ancient Egyptian context for that, because idols are ubiquitous and universal, right? In other words, as much as I appreciate, and what I was just referencing was Dr. David Falk's Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context, though I certainly appreciate the work that was being done there, nothing that was provided there would contradict what the 13th century European peasant farmer would understand about the Ark of the Covenant, right? And I think it is very, very important for us to understand this as a basic hermeneutical method, not just for the Bible, but really specifically for the Bible, because of the fact that it is for all peoples at all places at all times, but in a general sense, in a more general sense, not as extreme sense, for all texts in a way. And what I mean by that is words do have meaning, and those meanings are obviously what was meant to be communicated by the choosing of those words. It almost seems like a little bit of a tautology, right? So even when we're not talking about the Theonoustos word of Jehovah, we are still talking about somebody who consciously decided to choose the words that they put on paper, and those words have definitional value. So to ignore the literal reading to ignore the literal reading from the face, right, is, in my opinion, a very dangerous hermeneutic. And with that, of course, then let's get into the actual discussion as far as Genesis 1, although I think that is a huge part of the discussion here today, right? So Genesis 1, of course, is our creation narrative, right? It goes through the different 6 days of creation. Technically, it does not actually end on the seventh. The seventh day actually is in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. But we get the creation of heaven and earth, and the seas and the sea creatures and the stars and so on and so forth, right? And we see it laid forward in a structured format, these things coming out in day 1, these things coming out in day 2, day 3, so on and so forth, and they tend to be related with each other. They also actually tend to couple with each other, fun fact. Day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, day 3 and day 6, if you actually look at what is being created, are kind of rhyming, so to speak, with each other. For example, in day 1, God creates the light and the darkness. And in day 4, God creates the sun, moon, and stars, right? Day 3 sees the creation of dry land and the seas. I believe it's day 3. I think I'm mixing that up. Doesn't matter. You guys get the idea. It does actually matter, but I'm not going to go ahead and waste my time trying to remember something that I should have had written down. But you get the whole point, right? So you have day 6, the creation of the animals. Day 3, the creation of dry land. Day 2, you have creation of these vast waters. Day 5, you have the creation of water creatures. Day 1, you have the creation of the light and the darkness. Day 4, you have the creation of the things which are in the heavens, right? So we actually do notice there are some couplings here. And then it's a 6 plus 1, meaning your Sabbath day is actually separated from these couplings. Now, if we read the text plainly, bare minimum, the scientific facts that I think is taught by this text are thus. Number 1, God, of course, created the world at a point in time. I think we're not going to get in dispute there. Number 2, he did it in a fashion where certain things came before other things, right? In other words, there was sea creatures before there was land creatures. There were stars before there were land or sea creatures, excuse me. There was light before there was dry land. So if we understand the text as actually being in a chronological order, then that is very clearly at least a bare minimum scientific fact that seems to be communicated to us, right? How exactly these things are to reproduce, right? We see that they have seeds after their own kind or produce after their own kind. This is certainly a scientific fact. We see the function of these things. For example, the sun, moon, and stars are for signs, seasons, the years, all these other kinds of things. And so we can see actually why God has created them. And that should ring true scientifically, right? We should be able to look at a solar year, realize that that actually corresponds with the sun's cycle. We should be able to look at a lunar cycle and realize that corresponds with our modern month or the month that they would have had in the past, right? And so on and so forth with these sorts of things. These are just bare minimum scientific facts that I think are absolutely taught by Genesis 1. But why must we understand these facts as scientific, or it just as literal is really what we're trying to get at here. And for that, we now have to understand what is the genre of the book of Genesis. It is universally agreed by even the most liberal of scholars that Genesis is a historical narrative. Now, that does not mean that every single thing in Genesis is historical narrative. For example, very many people will say Genesis 1 through 11 is what you call proto-history. Other people would call this mythology in the actual folklorist sense, not in the modern colloquial sense. But they understand that the people who wrote it and were reading it understood it as a historical narrative. There's also, of course, going to be poetic language used in historical narratives. Many of you may have heard the saying, on the Crusades, when they came into Jerusalem, there was blood up to everyone's knees. That's obviously poetry. That doesn't mean that that particular history text that we get that from, which I believe comes from Bede the Venerable, is actually a poetic text. It is still a historical narrative, right? Excuse me. So why do they understand this as a historical text? Well, because you actually have a narrative beginning with Genesis 1 and ending with Genesis 50 that continues all the way through to the eventual conquest of Israel in 586 BC and never seems to skip a beat saying, hey, we're actually talking a little bit mythological here. Hey, we're actually talking a little bit allegorical here. Rather, it just seems to count through. This is the history of the Jewish people. This is the lineage of the tribe of David, and so on and so forth. Let me give you an example. So why is Joseph in Egypt? Or better yet, why are the Jews in Egypt when Moses comes? Well, because Joseph was invited, him and his family, to Egypt. Why was Joseph in Egypt? He was sold into slavery. Why was Joseph sold into slavery? Because his brothers hated him. Why did they hate him? Because of the story that comes before, as far as him having the dreams and saying that he was going to be greater than everyone else. Well, where does that all come from? Well, they're all the kids of a man named Jacob, who we call Yisrael. And where does Jacob come from? Well, he's the son of a man named Isaac. And where does Isaac come from? Well, he's the son of a man named Abraham. And where does Abraham come from? Well, you have this big list of the different patriarchs that go before the flood. What's that flood that we're talking about? Well, that's a pretty big event. You see what I'm saying? And you go on and on and on. This is a line that's actually tracing. It went from this point to this point to this point to this point. And if you start to remove some of those pillars, you start to destroy the historical narrative. Just to give an example of this, if the chronology cannot be trusted of 6,000 years or so, right? Then why are we to assume that the chronology can be trusted when we're going up to Abraham? We can't trust the chronology from Adam to Abraham, so why should we trust the chronology from Moses to Abraham? And if we can't trust it from Moses to Abraham, why should we trust it from David to Moses? And if we can't trust it from David to Moses, why should we trust it from Jesus to David? And so on and so forth. And you see what I'm saying? Like, these things are actually basing their previous, basing their current text, right? Basing their current communications on what has come before. And the most obvious sense there is chronologically. Another obvious sense there is genealogically, right? If we can't trust that the text is actually communicating a proper genealogy when it comes to the early creation narratives, then why can we trust that it's giving us a proper genealogy when it comes to the latter creation or latter genealogical narratives, right? In other words, if we don't actually know that Adam lived hundreds and some odd years and then begot Seth, then what makes us so confident that the same thing would happen to Abraham or to Isaac or to David, right? As far as these begettings and so on and so forth, right? Genealogies and chronologies are not the only things, but these are just the most obvious things that clearly demonstrate that this is a historical narrative, starting from Genesis 1 and going all the way through really until the end of the Old Testament, right? Excuse me. Well, specifically Genesis 1, though, how does Genesis 1 in particular create problems for our understanding of historical narrative? Well, there's a couple things. Number one, there is nothing within the text that demonstrates a change from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, right? In fact, if you want to get technical, the closest you could get is Genesis 2:3, right? But all of the different translators have not actually placed the end of Genesis 1 at Genesis 2:3. They have actually gotten us, they have actually said that Genesis 2 starts at that verse number 1. Why? Well, there's various reasons they're obviously going to give for that. But the point is that they don't recognize that as a breaking point where you left a thought and are now moving on to another. It's all the same narrative, right? And the point where they did decide to break isn't that point where you would consider it to be a breakage, right? Why? That seems to be incredibly important. I would say it's because there is no actual breakage here. What we actually have going on is just the continuing story as far as, hey, this is what's coming next, and now we're going to create Adam in the Garden of Eden and all these other different kinds of things, right? Another thing that shows us that this is a historical narrative is the fact that the creation of man is said to be the beginning by Jesus, right? Well, if that's the beginning, that's a chronological statement, right? That chronological statement goes all the way back to day number 7 in chapter 2. No, day number 6 in chapter 1. That's when God created man, right? That's a chronological statement saying this was the beginning. And by the way, if the beginning is 3 million years separated from the actual creation event, then it's not really the beginning, right? In other words, when the old Earth creationist, which I know is not Mr. Vela, but when the old Earth creationist would say something along the lines of, well, it's the 6th day isn't actually the 1st day, so it's therefore not the beginning. Well, interestingly enough, that would actually work on an old Earth model. It doesn't work on a young Earth model because you're only separated by 5 days, right? But what if Jesus was actually separated by millions of years? He says in the beginning, without context, because he doesn't say the beginning of humans, he doesn't say the beginning of marriage. He just says in the beginning, this is the way that it was. Well, what if that really wasn't the beginning? What if that was actually 3 billion, some odd years separated from the actual beginning? Well, then Jesus is just wrong here, right? So here we see another demonstration of this actually being linked in historical narrative format to the rest of the text. Now, you'll very often see people say things like, well, this is a temple dedication of some kind, or this is a polemic of some kind, or this is something that adopts from the various understandings from the ancient Near East. And there is various levels of truth to that, in my opinion. I don't have any problem with John Walton's temple dedication because I can simply grant it and continue to be a young Earth creationist. It runs into what I call the so what wall, meaning so what? It doesn't have any impact on what I'm actually trying to say. As far as the polemic narrative in no way, shape, or form would dissuade us from understanding this as historical or scientific for that matter. To give a perfect example of that, it is very clearly acknowledged by very many biblical scholars, both evangelical, conservative, and progressive liberal, that there, excuse me, that there is polemic in the plagues of Moses, right? The plagues of Moses seem specifically geared to take out the Egyptian political system, the Egyptian hierarchy, and the different Egyptian gods. Does that mean they didn't actually happen? Of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. In fact, that they actually happened is sort of the polemic, is it not? right? In other words, the polemic wouldn't work if Moses wasn't actually there doing something to the Pharaoh, doing something with the frogs, doing something to the Nile. And likewise, I think the same is true here. This polemic doesn't actually work if the narrative isn't true, right? So once again, yeah, it can totally be a polemic. I can grant that, and we run into the so what wall. So what? I can still be a young earth creationist, and in fact, I still think the text can teach young earth creationism or old earth creationism for that matter. There's nothing in that particular argument that says the text does or does not teach a certain thing. What about the borrowing from different texts around? This is kind of a complex one. There is certainly some elements of borrowing. But one of the things that I would quickly point out is if you expect these things to be historical narrative, then any text which comes before these texts should communicate that historical narrative. In other words, if the flood actually happened at a point in time, and humans really do derive from the people who got off that ark, then it would make sense that people who were not the scriptural writers, writing before the scriptural writers, would record that historical fact, right? And this can be done in very many different ways. We talk about the Garden of Eden in Sumerian text. Thank you very much. We see talk about the heptadic structure, right? Well, if the universe really was created in 7 days, then the heptadic structure is something that would be built into humanity because of the fact that we all stem from this common creation event, and so on and so forth, right? And so for all these different various reasons, I think that while you can grant and not grant some of these texts, really they're all going to run into that same thing. Your so what wall. So what? I'm still perfectly justified in taking my young earth creation perspective. And in fact, maybe even more justified in taking my young earth perspective because I'm still adhering to the sensus literalis, the Peshat of the text. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hop off. We got a lot to talk about today. Hope that was a good presentation of my view, and let's get right into it.
All right. Thank you, CJ, for your 20-minute opening statement. That concludes the opening statements. Great job to the both of you. Lots of good points for us to discuss in this next portion as we move into the discussion. Since CJ, you just ended with your 20-minute opening statement, why don't we hand it over to Tyler to start us off in the dialogue portion.
Yeah.
And the floor is yours, guys.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, CJ, for that. I that was very, very, very interesting. I enjoyed that quite a bit. And the interesting thing about this conversation, and you touched on this with the so what. While I think there's more to be said than that. I've made this point regularly, and this is why I thought this would be more interesting as a discussion than a debate. Is that there's a sense where my view should not be threatening really to anyone else's view. My friend Steve Schramm, Mark Lambert, a bunch of others I've talked to, they basically said, like, maybe they're not fully convinced of my view, but they're like, yeah, even if we were to read Genesis 1 entirely as a polemical temple text, and we understood that way, it doesn't threaten younger. I mean, you could still believe it for scientific grounds. You could still, I mean, it doesn't contradict any of the scientific beliefs, any of the dating of the earth. And in some ways, it actually goes well with kind of any of the views with how they handle the text, as long as they're exegetically responsible. So there's a sense where I agree with you on the so what wall, and I didn't want this to be that much of a debate because it's not that our views are like old earth and young earth. Those are contradictory views.
Right.
Our views aren't intrinsically contradictory, even though I would say at the end of the day, I think my view is a better way to handle reading the passage. And I have issues with young earth creationism. But I just wanted to, tip my hat to you on that I don't think we're actually that far off on your final point. I did maybe want to start this off with a couple of questions. I do have some reasons why I think the typical young earth reading is just incorrect. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your discussion about the ordinary and the plain meaning of a passage. Right. And if we read something, we shouldn't have to go to the ancient Near Eastern context to understand what something means. Right. So I commonly ask this, right? Because do you get an anatomical understanding from the Bible in the same way you're asking us to get your cosmological understanding from the Bible?
Well, I do definitely think that's an excellent question. What I think the thing is I think there are different, how would I put this, different flavors of the concordist answer to this. Whereas, like, if I were to say the Bible teaches you an explicit cosmology, I don't think that's true, right? It doesn't say anything about the Milky Way. It doesn't say anything about Andromeda and all that other kind of stuff, right? Rather, though, what I would say is where it does speak about cosmology, it is accurate, right? And so in the case of physiology, I assume you're probably talking about the lead-kidney association. Well, really, the word leb is actually not typically translated as kidney. It's usually translated as the inner man in a spiritual sense, or as the heart in the sense of Jeremiah 17, or and some people will call it the what would you call that? The it's kind of like your stomach area, but it's not bowels. I think
your range. Well, no, bowels is a different one. So bowels and kidney are two different things.
But yeah, and so I might be getting that particular. Sorry.
No, it's well. Let me state the question a little bit more pointedly, right? And for those who are kind of missing the context, the flavor in the Hebrew world, because your answer is, well, it's normally translated this way, and I'm going to say, well, yes, because our translators are helping us into modern English. They're helping us out in the Hebrew when it says to love the Lord your God with all of your mind, or God is going to search your mind, or anything like that. The Hebrew word is it's kidneys. There's zero question. It's the same word that's used in all the Levitical things about what organ you actually take out.
Actually, though, I do want to push back on that a little bit, though, because the word that we have for kidneys when we're talking about like removing the fat from the kidneys and stuff like that, very often it's actually kilya and not leb. Leb is and the thing about leb is it's not like, for example, we have the word sky, right? And sky in Hebrew would be translated as I think hashamayim is how you would say the skies, right? But the Hebrew isn't like strictly how would you say shackled to the word skies, right? It could also be translated as heaven. It could also be translated as space. It could also be translated as firmament sometimes, although typically rakia is what you translate as firmament.
Yeah.
The point being that Hebrew, because it's so much more limited, right? There's only something like 4,000 words, I think, in the biblical lexicon.
Yep.
Because it's so much more limited, it ends up using. Say again.
I think it's like 6,500 words. Way less. Way less.
Right. We got like something like 180,000, right? And so because of that like limited lexical format of the ancient Hebrew, you often find these words like leb, for example, where it is properly translated as heart, and it could also be properly translated as the inner man, and it could also properly be translated as your in words, and it could also properly be translated likely as I haven't personally seen it translated as kidney, but I use a specific Bible version, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean anything.
But again, sorry to interrupt, but again, that's a translational issue, right? So when you say, well, it's properly translated, right? Well, the reason why it's properly translated as mind is because that's the concept that it's going for in those. The issue is that in the ancient Near Eastern world, your kidneys are literally what they thought you thought with, and the kidneys, by the way, I mean, it's a beautiful organ. It's very pretty rose color. I mean, it's a nice organ. The brain, when they did like, embalming ceremonies on concept, it was just a hookup. They pull it out, they throw it away. They did not think your brain is what you thought with, right? So when they say that the love of the Lord your God with all of your kidneys, they were literally thinking like that's what the original audience would have thought. That's their anatomical understanding. Now, my point would be, and this is why I take a non-concordant position on this, is because, well, it just seems that God is coming down saying, hey, whatever it is that you think with, love the Lord your God with all that. God's not trying to fix their he's not trying to say, here's Grey's Anatomy, I'm going to try to fix it for you. Right. He's just, and so when we translate that into English, our English translators are helping us by saying heart or mind, because that's how the concept, that's the concept hook between the two. That's what it means in English, right? I
understand what you're saying there, but I do want to give what I think would be not necessarily a pushback, but perhaps an illumination of my view in this particular regard. So, are you familiar with the phrase "erek afayim"?
Say it slower.
Erek afayim.
No.
So it means long nose. Technically, it means long nostrils.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually translate it, which you translate it as typically is long suffering. Now how the heck does that happen, right? How do you get long suffering from long nose? Yep. Well, it's a Hebrew idiom where when you would, they had this idea that when you flare it up, right, your nose right? And so if you have a long nose, long nostrils, it takes a long time for them to flare up, right? It's like saying you have a long fuse, but of course back then they didn't have dynamite, so that wouldn't have made any sense. Now the translation of Eragafayim is never going to be long nose, right? It's always going to be long suffering, even though that's not technically what it means. Now you could say, so is that the translation helping us by communicating something that's not actually necessarily there? Or is it the translation helping us by understanding there are certain idioms that we might communicate differently? And we can do a reverse of this too. Nostalgia is a pretty uniquely English word. Heimweh is the best that you tend to get in German, just as an example. But Heimweh actually means homesickness. It doesn't mean like longing for your past or anything like that, right?
Right.
But when you translate nostalgia, you do have the concepts there, right? You can say, oh, I was feeling somber for my yesteryears or something like that, right? That's not a word for word translation, so to speak. But it does communicate number one, what is meant to be communicated by the original audience, and number two, what is actually technically being communicated by the words, right? Does that kind of make sense of the view that I'm taking here as far as like why I wouldn't have an issue with the kidney thing?
I'm not sure it answers it, but I think we can move on. I mean, let me just say, I think there's going to be an issue where we say, look, we only take the plain meaning. My major concern for that is we don't typically do that, especially in academic exegesis of a passage. Right now, I agree with you that if you get with something that's so exotic that the original audience is or the reading audience is going to be completely lost, right? I mean, I hold the perspicuity of Scripture. I think the general message of the Scripture is so clear that my 6-year-old can understand it. That doesn't mean, however, that we take a hyper-perspicuous view that every single passage is that way, right? There are certain passages where we say, look, we just have to understand the original background to know how the author would have intended this for the audience, and that's okay, right? So I just don't want to push perspicuity so far that it breaks.
Well, so let me ask: Would you say there is a difference between something being plain or face value and something being wooden literal?
There would, and so I don't necessarily mean that in a wooden literal sense. I mean, you and I are both, we're Reformed. We're probably different type of Reformed, but we're kind of within that same redemptive historical reading approach to it, right? Mm-hmm. I think that we would say when neither of us are dispensationalists, is my point. Neither of us are going to say you have to read something as literal. By literal, we mean literary, right? Whether that we understand that. My point is that there's going to be certain things in the Scriptures where we're going to say, look, if we read it and we said, if it's not clear to the modern author, then we've done something wrong in our exegesis. And I'm going to say, well, no, there's all kinds of things that we need to actually study, the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds, the Hellenistic backgrounds, to understand what in the world is even happening in this passage. What is going on? We gain a whole bunch of understanding about what these certain passages mean, why certain narratives are happening in certain ways, certain agricultural things that are happening, right? Certain political things. There's all kinds of things where if you just read it at a plain value, right? So this is why I said in general, perspicuity, a plain reading is fine. What I don't want to say is that has to be the case for every single individual verse or passage, because that would actually do all kinds of violence to the passage. And this might be going a little far, but I'm speaking a little hyperbolically, but only a little, is that's a very modern reader response way to read a passage. And I don't think that that's a good way to go about approaching ancient texts, inspired or otherwise.
So there is an interesting note that I kind of want to get at with that, and I kind of brought it up earlier with the 13th century European farmer and all that, right? How in my personal hermeneutic, it seems like the guy it was originally written to and the guy 100 years ago who probably didn't even know how to read and me should all be able to get the same understanding from the text. Would you consider that to be fair?
It depends, right? As long as we all have access to the same information, then yes. Right. So you and I are going to read, for example, we are post Copernican revolution, right?
Right.
I doubt you're a flat earther. I doubt you're a geocentrist. Maybe
Right.
you are, but I doubt it. Right? Yeah, fair?
Yeah,
Okay.
fair.
We are going to read the passages about the sun moving in the sky and the four corners of the earth and all that kind of stuff. Very different. I mean, again, I'm medieval people weren't flat earthers either, but I think you get my point, right?
Mhm.
We're going to read those passages very differently. In fact, it caused a whole bunch of controversy in the church where they said, look, you Copernicans, you are mishandling that. No one would read it this way. What are you trying to do? This is not your everyday reading, right? We're post-Copernican, we're going to come along and say, oh, well, we can rescue inspiration because we can understand that God can reveal his word, his intent, his meaning incarnationally, phenomenologically. There's all these kind of other language things that can happen. We don't have to read it in the quote unquote plain sense that would have been plain to the medieval audience, right? So we have all kinds of counter examples to this where what's plain to us now is not what was plain to the medieval, and is 100% not what was plain to what a Hellenistic or even an ancient Near Eastern Mesopotamian Hebrew would have understood the passage to be.
Well, I think there is truth to that, and I also think that there is a sense in which this runs into what I think is I would like to just term it a Chestertonian problem, because G.K. Chesterton is the one who gave me the solution to it, but he didn't note the problem when he was giving the solution. If you've ever read Orthodoxy, he talks about what he calls paradoxes of Christianity, which is when you have two things that, like, and his example that he gives is martyrdom and suicide. Suicide is a sin, but martyrdom is glorious, right? And that seems contradictory, but then of course he explains the different ways as to like how two things can be true at once that appear contradictory if you have some sort of outside information, right?
Right.
Well, so let's take, for example, the earth is fixed, right? Well, there's a very serious sense in which that is true, because you and I will never experience in a million years any motion on this planet, barring an earthquake or something like that, right? And yet there is also a very real sense in which the earth is not fixed, it's moving, right? Why is that? Well, there's a third piece of information that one would be lacking that makes both of those things true at the same time. Namely, the earth is large enough that it can appear to everybody on it to not be moving at all, while also be moving. Another perfect example of that is I've often told people, the earth is flat, right? And they'll be like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, go outside and look, but it's round also. Why? Well, there's another piece of information there. It's large enough that if you're a small enough creature, it appears flat to you, but it does actually have curvature in its full shape, right? And in other words, what I'd be saying there is I think we can have things be true in one sense and not necessarily true in another sense, right? And the geocentrism, I think, is probably a really good example of that. I don't think that it's wrong to say that the sun moves, because you just got to go outside and look. It certainly does move across the sky. But it's also true that it doesn't move, right? And there's an extra piece of information that you may or may not be lacking that explains how those two seemingly contradictory things could both be true.
Yeah, and I get that. I'm just not sure that how that relates to our disagreements about Genesis 1. So for example, there are a lot of objections to literal readings of Genesis 1 that are bad, right? So well, Adam is made with the appearance of age. That's God lying, right? I mean, those are just dumb. Those are just silly types of objections that people give to Earth Christianism, right? I think there are a lot of other substantial ones. Although I think that some of the ones about like the order of Genesis 1 are valid, right? I think they're good, right? I mean, I take a broadly literal framework view, kind of underpinning my entire view, where I think there is this literal structure that happens, which I'm glad you mentioned. But for example, on day 1, you have the separation of the light from the darkness, right? It's a definite article, the light from the darkness.
Mm.
In day 4, you have let me actually I pulled it up so we can read it together. In day 4, we have this interesting thing that happens, right? So God's, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, right? So their purpose is to separate the day from the night, which is weird since you've already had ostensibly the separation from the day from the night. I know there's ways to get around that. I'm not saying it's a contradiction, but it's weird. It's actually in verse 18 though that I think that there's a problem. And I think a lot of people who object, they just say, oh, well, how was there sun and earth created after there was light? I think that's a silly objection. I understand why you all protest that. However, in verse 18, it says, God placed in the expanse of the heavens and give light on the earth, and to govern the day and light, and to separate the light from the darkness. Right? The function of the sun and the moon is to separate the definite articled light from the darkness. That's their job. That doesn't happen until those exist. That's what they do, right? But if you have in day one, God has already separated the day from the night and called it good. You have this weird again, I'm not saying it's a contradiction, but I'm saying it's very problematic to say at some point between day 1 and day 3, the light, again, this is not a light, this isn't a supernatural light, this isn't all those kind of other explanations. This is the definite article light, the definite article darkness, the exact same terms. Some point they fuse back together in order for the sun and the moon to separate them again, even though God had separated it and called it good. And it doesn't happen until the sun and the moon exist. Again, I'm not saying it's I'm just, I think that there are more, I think that there's some robust problems that arise with a literal reading. Same thing with, you have plants created before man in the first creation account. And in the second, you have man created before plants. Now you could say, well, that's plants of the field, right? That's a specific kind of plant. It's just, there's a certain amount where we say, okay, but there's so many of these. I mean, I have a list of them. There's so many of them. It just kind of at a certain point kind of snowballs into a pretty big avalanche of incredulity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I certainly get the point. I think I would say I think there's a couple things within the text that kind of show us what exactly is going on. Is like, for example, with the light, I would say that you have and this has just been my own personal, understanding of it. So I guess it could be wrong, but it seems to me like there is a creation of light and darkness, and then a creation of the things which you could say govern light and darkness, right? And it appears that same thing happens with other things in Genesis 1 as well. For example, on day 2, God creates the firmament that separates the waters from the waters, right? And he has it calls the creation of this sky, right? But then he populates all the different things that are in the heavens on day 4 and not on actually day 2, right? You kind of see this also with the water itself. In day 1, the Spirit of God is hovering above the waters, right? And then he divides the waters and he has land and water. But then he seemingly kind of does that again, right? When he makes seas and earth. And so what I think you have going on here is the creation of things and then the placing of things into order, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you have what Klein called the creation of the kingdoms and then the kings of the kingdoms, right? Or the forming and the filling. Here though, I think my objection is different though. So I appreciate that. I mean, I think the literary framework is a really helpful way to understand the passage. I think it can undergird any view, really. Again, but my point though is that it's not just forming and then there's this parallel to filming. I'm not just saying that part's weird, right? It's that you have the separation of the darkness from the light from the darkness, the singular, definite articled light from the darkness. And then you have the creation 3 days later, if this is a literal 24 days, if 3 days later of the sun and the moon, and their function, their purpose is to separate the definite articled light from the darkness, which ostensibly had already happened 3 days previously. And so at some point, if you're a literist, at some point, that thing that God did, which he called good, the separation light from the darkness, had to have gotten undone. And now the sun and the moon serve the function of separating those two things. And they now have to do that over and over again. And by the way, you can't use the out of, well, this just means that they order the daytime from the nighttime, right? Because those are actually different words. And that's used to separate the day from the night in verse 14. Right. So it reverts back to the definite articled light from the darkness, right? The haover and the hubin, right? So you have do you understand the kind of, it's not quite the same thing as just, well, there's forming and filling.
Well, yeah, no, I certainly get that. But so let me use, I'll pull it up actually so that I can kind of actually read it. The quickest one I got pulled up is the NIV, so I'm sorry if anybody doesn't like that. But I just was going for speed here.
But the not inspired version.
Right. So he says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, the earth there is not referring to the globe, right? It's the Eretz, or the land, right?
Land, yeah.
But then we see later on, if we go down, let's see, I think it's day 3. Yes, God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place and let dry ground appear, right? And he called the dry ground Eretz. So it seems like here in the same text, we have a different issue that's a lot kind of similar to what you're saying, right? He created Eretz, and then he created Eretz, right? That seems to be contradictory. But it's only contradictory, I think, if we're reading it as a secondary creation event rather than the ordering of things already created. We have heavens and earth existing. Now we're going to put them in their proper place, right? And to give kind of an analogy, you could say, so you have like Play-Doh, and Play-Doh exists, but then you put Play-Doh in the Play-Doh container and you give it to a kid, and then the kid turns the Play-Doh into whatever it functions as, right? In the case of light and day, it's not that they're literally separating the light from the darkness, because that was already done previously, but rather these things are serving the function of what we would see as separating the light from the darkness. Because again, they're for signs and for seasons and for days and all those other sorts of things, right? And so that would kind of be the way I would respond to it, looking at the way that I see Eretz used. And I think water, it has the same kind of thing, right? Because God hovers over the face of the waters, but then he gathers the waters. Well, if we already had separated waters for him to hover over that were on the earth, what are you gathering the waters into exactly, right? And again, I think it's just the idea of we created the waters, now we're ordering the waters so that they are seas. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of me would push back and just say that. And again, I don't want to say like you're doing gymnastics. I understand you're not doing gymnastics. You're doing conceptual analysis and trying to exegete the passage, right? Part of me wants to go back and say, but like if I was a medieval person, none of what you just said would be the plain meaning of the passage, right? But that's your whole thing is, well, we should only go with the plain meaning of the passage, right? So part of what I want to point out in this discussion is kind of, maybe it's a mea culpa, but we all do it, right? There's a sense where you cannot push perspicuity so rigidly onto every passage to say, well, we don't do these certain things. We don't do these certain exegetical hermeneutical things where we're looking at, what the author would have meant, what the background text would have meant, kind of, how do we reconcile these kind of things, right? We all do it to a certain degree. I just think that if I'm going to do it, right, if I'm going to try to understand the authorial intent and the sensus literalis of a passage, right, and again, I'm not accusing you of literalism in the dispensational sense that literal has to be like woodenly literal and you think Jesus is a wooden door or anything like that. I mean, right. I understand the literary sense of the passage, right? But part of the literary sense of the passage is what would the original author have meant, right? Divinely inspired and all. It's not that, I personally think that Moses was I take a redactional view. I think Moses was largely the main author. However, someone like Caleb or Joshua or someone in the Mosaic community redacted together some other final to get to the final form, right? So I take a Mosaic community authorship view, but Moses is the primary source, right? So I think that when we say, okay, what would Moses have meant on the plains of Moab, waiting to enter the promised land, when he's writing the majority of this text, what would he have meant to the children of Israel in that time, right? And it just when I study through what their worldview was, what their beliefs were, or all that, and in conjunction, you read the Psalms about creation, right? None of it, all of it sounds like ancient text. That all of that concords together. None of it comes across as a modern scientific treatment about material origins.
Well, and so there is, and this is one area where I will say there is a level of agreement I have with you as far as some people will go as far with their concordism as to say that like we can derive certain scientific facts we don't know from this text. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. Yeah. And I would say in a way, like if you wrote a book about wrote like a romance in 1940s Germany, the point isn't to write the history of 1940s Germany, but you probably recorded it. You know what I mean? And so in that sense, I would say it's not so much that I would go that far as to say, like, we need to make this our cosmology. Rather, I would say the cosmological facts recorded here are accurate. So that would be one thing I want to say is a little bit different. I know it's a nuanced difference, but I think it is a large difference, right? Because it would, like I said, it'd be the difference between a history book about 1940s Germany and a love story that happened to take place in 1940s Germany, right?
Or an epic polemical temple text about what happened in 1940s
Well,
Germany.
there's a level of truth to that, though, right? Because we have, like, for example, and even as somebody who would consider myself more literalist, right? Exodus 15, great example. Exodus 15, when it states facts, it does record them accurately.
Right.
But it's not necessarily meant to be the historical narrative of the Exodus, right? That's what the rest of the book is for. It's really a poem kind of going back to that time. Another modern example is like Flanders Field. Flanders Field isn't really meant to teach you about what happened on Flanders Field, but the facts that it records about Flanders Field are accurate, right? And so I do think there, like I said, it's a nuanced difference, but it is a difference nonetheless, right?
I wonder what you do with like Psalm 19 and other creation psalms. Like, so there are multiple psalms about creation, right? Mm-hmm. They're poems. I don't think Genesis 1, by the way, is poem. I don't think it's allegory. So that's a whole different discussion, because some people think like there's either literal or symbolic allegory, and I just think that that's too crass of that's just a false dichotomy. There's all kinds of other things that happen, especially in ancient literature. But some people seem to think that it says, okay, well, if something is poetry, it's not actually describing the real thing that happened. And I want to say, well, we have Psalms about creation. They are telling very meaningful, true things, concrete things about creation. Right?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with a lot of that. And certainly. And so I think when it comes to something, and the Psalms are a great example, right? Because the Psalms they're by definition poems, right? So to take them in their plain reading, you would have to, paradoxically, not take them plain all the time, right?
Yeah. But their plain meaning is they're poetic. That's part of the plain meaning. Yeah.
That said, though, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's not stating certain, and kind of like you're even hinting to, right? It certainly is stating very serious facts sometimes. It just as an example of that is creation specific, and is one that I think everybody would agree on, non-controversial. The heavens declare the glory of God, right? I can't tell you how many times an atheist asked, well, what was the point of the Andromeda Galaxy? It's like, well, you just asked that question. That's the point of the Andromeda Galaxy. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like awesome. It demonstrates the awesomeness, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the poem is 100% literal, right? So I do acknowledge that the poetry can record facts without necessarily being 100% factual. Now, what I would say there is, I think there is an error, and this is not something that I think you would run into, but I think a lot of OEC run into this, where you take the poetic text that you'll find in Psalm and try to use that to dissuade people from a plain reading of Genesis 1, which I believe to be historical narrative, and I think it should be the other way around. Not that you dissuade anybody from believing anything, but that if one is meant to be literal and the other not, then you should take it literal. You should have the literal paint your lens of the other, right? The poetic.
And that's just, you and I would agree on that. Right. I wouldn't say we need to interpret Genesis a certain way because we have these poetic passages that mean certain, right? That would just be to flip proper hermeneutics in the analogy of faith on its face. Right. So I mean, that would just be really poor hermeneutics. I'm curious. I'm not saying I've convinced you of my view or anything like that. However, let's say you could be convinced that that temple text is a genre of literature in the ancient world, right? Would it not be, if we say, okay, well, that is a certain genre, we see these features, and I tried to lay out what some of those features were. That is a genre, and we see these features. That the sensus literalis, the literary sense, and understanding it, when we say, well, what now? How do we understand Genesis 1? Genre is a major consideration of what the sensus literalis. We just talked about it with poetry. Right. So if we said, okay, well, reading Genesis, we understand the genre is a temple text, right? Wouldn't we still be reading the plain literal reading of it, just within the confines of what that genre normally is?
Yeah, actually. So, and now it's an interesting thing to bring up, because ironically, this question became very important to me recently in regards to a recent conviction of mine that has nothing to do with our debate, but I believe Jesus was born on December 25th. Now, part of that is because it makes a lot of sense for me for Jesus to be born on the first day of the temple dedication ceremony, Hanukkah, right? That's not the whole argument, but it's a big part of the argument, right? And so the idea that this is God's temple, earth, right, is one of God's temples, is sort of built into that assumption, right? Because God is here reclaiming this for himself. And what is he reclaiming? Creation. That would make creation a temple in the analogy with Hanukkah, right? So that is all to say that this is something that became very much more real to me recently, that the idea of creation is a temple. That said, though, when we look at other temple dedication texts, whether they be found in First Maccabees or in Exodus or in First Kings, or even when we're talking about the Temple of Ishtar, for example, right? They are still recording, I think, historical facts, right? Like, for example, when we have the evening and the morning first day thing that goes on in the temple dedication texts, right? I don't think that's necessarily trying to say that this is some special, unique kind of non-literal day, but it is definitely using a terminology that is specific for the dedication of temples, right? So it would just be a way to say, it's not that I wouldn't be convinced of your view. In fact, in a way, I kind of am. I think that there is some truth to the idea that Genesis 1 is the temple text. I just don't think that that means that what it's recording is non-factual or non-literal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's total. That, I mean, that's entirely fair. And I have to say, I'm actually not surprised that the more I have conversations with young Earth creationists, the more that are. I mean, you're clearly very intelligent, well read.
Thank you.
That there's a sense where I'm finding a lot of them are saying we actually agree 100% with your view. We just think that's how God did it. And there's a certain feature of mine where because I think that it's very, very clear that a solar calendar week just is the framework that's used for Genesis 1. I don't think that the author meant it as anything besides a solar calendar week. I just think it's used as a literary motif rather than an actual ontological calendar in which it occurred. But there's a certain sense where I'm going to say, okay, but it's not surprising to me that a lot of young Earth creationists are finding an affinity for a view like mine, because part of what built into it is that one of the literary features is that the motif just is a calendar week, and that's fine. So, it's one of the reasons, again, why, what I said at the beginning, where I wanted this to be more of a discussion than a debate, because I don't think that our views are at odds with each other necessarily, even though at the end of the day, I'm going to say, well, the things that make you a literal young Earth creationist, I just don't find those convincing. And as I said in my opening statement, I would just need a lot stronger arguments than things like the Vav consecutive or Yom plus an ordinal and those type of typical arguments that are used, because they're just those ones aren't good. I think the ones you've given have been much stronger than those ones that I typically hear. So I appreciate that. But I still am at the point where I find them unnecessary in order to understand the text.
Yeah, and so first off, let me just say I do appreciate not only, of course, the compliments, right? Because who doesn't appreciate compliments? But I do appreciate what you're saying about like some of the bad arguments, because as one who has been, I grew up fundamentalist, so it's not like I necessarily left. I did to an extent because I actually grew up modalist. But regardless, if anyone's ever been around Oneness Pentecostals, those are some of the most fundamentalist people on the planet, right? So obviously left that. Now I'm a Reformed person and all that other kind of stuff. But regardless, not very much change in the hermeneutic. And I do definitely recognize that, like, for example, the cardinal numbering with yoms, right? That's just, when I started learning Hebrew, that was like day 2. And by the way, I'm not nearly proficient in Hebrew, but I'm just saying when I started the learning about a year ago, it was like, that's one of the very first things where it was like, yeah, that's just not true. You know what I mean? And so I do appreciate that there is, certain things that you hear that are they're just bogus, right? And the people who are saying them don't even necessarily mean them as bogus. They're not liars or unintelligent or anything like that, right? It's just things get propagated for years and years and years, and they just become talking points. But there are other things I think.
And when they're fact checking those, because they're looking only at a certain, and not you, but because they're looking usually only at a certain catalog of resources where that same thing has been perpetuated for so long, they're not actually finding the contrary information, right? So there's a certain kind of confirmation bias that happens.
Yeah, totally.
Well, let me jump in here real
right.
quick, CJ, before you respond there. And fantastic discussion, gentlemen. Very sophisticated. I'm really enjoying this. So is the chat, given the fact that we have so many great questions. I put roughly 40 minutes on the discussion, and we've got like a minute and a half left. Time has flown by, but I don't want to cut you guys off mid thought. Do you want to both maybe take a couple minutes in terms of like concluding thoughts for the discussion, just to wrap up your points, wrap up your thoughts? Would something like that work?
I mean, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I'm not sure. Like in some debates, I'm like, no, I have these like 5 points. Like, if I'm debating open theists, I'm going to have closing remarks. Here, right. I've enjoyed it. I'm not sure that there. I mean, maybe CJ, but there's not like certain like. I still want to go after these, 5 points. I don't know how you feel.
No, I actually do think this has been a really good talk too. I really appreciate having it as well, simply because like I said earlier, the idea of Genesis 1 as a temple text, for reasons completely unrelated to creation, has become something that I'm actually quite fond of, right? It helps another argument I've made very well. And that's, of course, not the only reason to be fond of it, but it's more like this one other argument has made me sort of retroactively realize that perhaps that's what I think about creation, right? Yeah. So I do appreciate having the talk, and I think it's been a good conversation so far. I do want to ask one question, if I may.
Of course.
So the week, from my understanding, has always been something where basically the understanding that I have is that the reason the 7-day week is the only week that seems to work, and I word it that way specifically because there are other weeks in other calendars, like they used to have an 8 and even a 9-day week in ancient Rome, but they fell apart, right? Like you just could not have. I mean, the calendar was so hectic, it was ridiculous, right? And the Pontifex Maximus had to literally add entire months some year to get back on track with the solar calendar, or subtract entire months, right? And so there's a whole thing with that goes back to the Julian reforms and all that kind of stuff. But the point is, anytime somebody tried to, you saw it again in revolutionary France, they had a 10-day week. Anytime they try to go away from the 7-day week, they just completely fall apart. So the question basically is, from my understanding, that's God created us, he created the universe in 7 days, or 7 epochs, if anybody prefers. I obviously don't believe that, but and therefore that's the only week that works, much like a solar year is the only year that works, and lunar month is the only month that works, because that's the way it's designed. So in your opinion, it seems like that couldn't be true, right? It would have to be maybe Moses is using the solar week and not the other way around. So I guess the question, it's not necessarily a question as much as just, is that true? Is that like, what would your explanation of a solar week be?
Yeah, I mean, part of me is going to say, well, I mean, we have leap year for a reason, because the 7-1 doesn't quite work. So, I mean, we basically have to add a fourth of a day every year. So if it was like perfectly to the second 7-day, maybe. I mean, besides that, I would just say, well, it's probably that the 7-day calendar worked and worked for a really long time before Moses. There are other cultures that observe the 7-day week,
right?
And so that was just a fruitful way to talk about the calendar week. I mean, maybe if they had a 10-day week, we'd be talking about the 10 days of creation. I don't exactly know. We can't kind of explore counterfactuals that way. So yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Well, and it's just that's kind of the end of the question there, right? I just wanted to kind of, because again, from the YUC perspective, right, the understanding has always been a 7-day week was instituted by God in the creation. But obviously, if you're not a young earth creationist, it just seems to me like it's almost like saying, if you believe that the earth is flat, then you don't believe it's round. It's right, obviously. And if you don't believe that this is a literal creation narrative, then that can't be where the week came from, right? So that was just the point of the question there.
All right, gentlemen, great discussion again. Fantastic discussion. It's always refreshing having these kind of informal debates, very respectful and cordial. And we got a ton of great questions here, a good mix of questions for Tyler, a good mix of questions for CJ. Therefore, why don't we go with our typical format here on this channel? Let's say the questions for Tyler. Of course, let's give Tyler the opportunity to answer it. But CJ, if you wanted to add anything, we'll give you that opportunity. And then we would just give the last word to Tyler here. So that worked for you guys. Want me to just jump into some of these audience questions?
Sure.
All right, let's do it. Let's have some fun. So let's start here near the bottom, since this is a question for both. This one comes in from Jimmy Stevens, and he asks a question for both participants. He says, what would you use as a way to falsify your position in favor of your opponents? And since it's for both, whoever would like to start.
Hey, Jimmy. I know Jimmy pretty well. I'm surprised he didn't ask me why I deny the mustard seed is the smallest. That's a kind of an on-running joke for him. All right. So I think what would falsify my view, well, it's hard because we have the text that we have, right? So what would falsify my view is a clearer text without all of the kind of literary structures and devices and polemic, all that kind of stuff. If there was a clearer statement of it, that would falsify my view. I think CJ is on the right track for what would falsify my view as well. And it's not necessarily what would falsify my view. It's what would bring me to, kind of marry a young earth view with my view. And I think that would be to go along and say, if you could show some type of area where I'm hermeneutically negligent or something along those lines, that I need to rethink actually the hermeneutical methodology that's being used here, that would go a long way to dissuade me of my view.
All right, I appreciate that, Tyler. And CJ, yeah, go ahead.
I think the best way probably to try and falsify a fundamentalist view would be to show reasonable evidence that another biblical author, or perhaps also a rabbi, would be good, just because they're in the Second Temple period, although they're obviously not as good as a biblical author, interpreted this in a non-literal way. Because then you'd immediately have a problem, right? If in the case of a Bible writer, you'd have to either conclude that these two contradict each other, or that the people of the biblical Israelite era were not necessarily understanding it literally, which would mean I'm obviously forcing my interpretation onto the text. But even with the Second Temple rabbis, you would at least have, I think, in that area, a lot of people saying that it's not literal who were in the same general time as the apostles, right? So not necessarily the Bible writers, but people we do take very seriously. Now, the thing is, that doesn't necessarily falsify. The first one, I think, would. If you had a biblical writer that actually understood this non-literally, I think that would be pretty good falsification. With a rabbi, not so much, right? Just because this is gonna be like a proper, what would you say, representation of the opinions that are around at that time. Yeah, probably, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And I would point out, in fairness to Mr. Vela, that second one with rabbis does exist, and it's something that we as young earth creationists have to deal with.
All right, I appreciate it. Great responses from the both of you. So this one comes in from Andrew Cumming. He's coming at you a little bit here, CJ Cox. This one's for you. He says, I'll have to nitpick you there, CJ. Just having certain ideas written in the Bible, or any book for that matter, does not make them scientific. What are your thoughts? How'd you like to respond to that, CJ?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd need a little bit more context as to what's trying to be communicated, because I would agree, just the idea that things are recorded in a text doesn't make them scientific, right? But if you're recording scientific facts, for example, if you're recording something like this is the category of flying creatures, which I know a lot of people like to pick on the Bible for putting flies in the bird category, but the word does mean flying creatures, right? And so it is scientifically accurate. That would be like, that's either true or false. Either these things do fly or they don't, right? And that's a matter of science there. Even if he wasn't necessarily coming at this with like, a little pitcher full of potion and stuff like that, it's still a scientific statement, right? So I guess that would be kind of my thoughts on there.
All right, I appreciate it, CJ. Anything you wanted to add to that at all, Tyler?
No, I mean, I think I largely agree with CJ. It depends on what you mean by, kind of how you use the term scientific, right? I mean, you can use a colloquial sense. Does it mean that it has to be, naturalistic, right? So, just because a certain idea is written doesn't necessarily mean it's scientific. I mean, there's all kinds of, we have theological facts that are written in the Bible that aren't scientific, but I don't know. I'm not sure how that's and no disrespect to the commenter, but I'm not sure how that's any type of criticism of what CJ has said.
All right, I appreciate it, guys. So this one now comes in for you specifically, Tyler. This one comes from Redefine Living. I appreciate the question. He says, Tyler, what are the scoffers in 2 Peter 3 denying when it says the world that then was being overflowed with water perished? And he gives a little more context. Let me see here. I'll put it up on screen. He says, more context. Was the Genesis flood local or global?
I mean, I'm not sure what what that has to do with the debate of Genesis 1. I know that there is a certain type of young earth reading that the flood is basically the paradigm to understand kind of backwards onto creation. I'm somewhat agnostic about the global flood. I think exegetically there are good reasons to think that it's local. I think there's good reason to think that, I've read good papers on both sides. So I don't hold really a strong position on whether the flood is global or local. I think that it was very, very, very clearly a theological judgment against the sins of humanity. And if I held to a local view rather than a global view, I would go along with, some of the views like Wenham or Walton, that it's a cosmic judgment played out on a microcosm scale. So there are all kinds of different readings on it. So, but I'm not sure that that's relevant for how we read Genesis 1.
Well, I appreciate that answer there, Tyler. And let me see, we got a ton of questions here. I'll try and pick one out that is really specific to Genesis 1 for you, CJ. And here's one. Jackson Rowe. He asks, how were stars and the sun created after light?
Well, I think light itself can be differentiated from the source of light. That is, so to give you an example of what I mean exactly by that, a individual bonfire may be the source of smoke, but that is not smoke in its entirety, right? And if you got rid of that individual bonfire, you would not have gotten rid of smoke. There's no real way to prove that if you got rid of all the stars, there would still be light, but I suspect if you got rid of all the stars, there would still be light. In other words, I don't think that it's necessarily the case that all light emanates from these celestial bodies. I don't have any way to necessarily prove that, but even if that wasn't the case, there is still a difference, I think, between the thing itself and what we might see as the source of the thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that, CJ. Anything you wanted to add to that, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think, a problem for a literal view, because it does seem in day one that what God is doing is separating the day from the light in a means of separating the morning from the evening. And it's a definite article. It's not a light from a darkness, right? It is the light from the darkness. So it's kind of, maybe it's hyperbole, but it's kind of all light from all darkness is really the idea, kind of and I don't exactly know what it means to separate from light from darkness, other than just creating light to drive out darkness. But so again, some of that material ontology kind of is an awkward fit, I think, into the passages like this. So I'm not convinced by an answer like that. I think this is somewhat of a problem, but
I appreciate it, Tyler. CJ, question was for you, if you want to have a quick final word.
Yeah, what I guess is a final word, I would just say, I think the initial point of what I'm saying would probably be granted by everybody, which is a thing can be separated from the source of its thing. The question really comes into, okay, well, does that mean that if you got, like I said, if you got rid of all the stars, that there would still be light? Possibly, right? Because hypothetically, of course, if you got rid of all fires, there wouldn't be smoke. So there is, just because a thing is separated from its potential source doesn't necessarily mean that it can exist apart from its potential source. So that, I think, would be the open question. And I will also just probably say that I don't know that, some of our explanations for things can be admittedly post hoc or ad hoc. I don't necessarily run from that, because we think of ad hoc and post hoc as bad words, when in reality they're really not. They can be, but not necessarily. And the only reason I bring that up is just to say I think I would admit that this is somewhat of a post hoc explanation. But I think that I would just be forced to take it. You know what I mean?
I appreciate that, CJ. So now we've got one here for you, Tyler, from One Way. So he asks, I got it up on screen here. He says, could the heptadic and mirror structures of the grammar and framework view just be due to a preference of symmetry?
Hey, One Way. Also another friend. Appreciate you being here. One Way is like the best hype man. He's always like in his channel on Discord. He's like, go watch the videos. Hey. Yeah, so there is a sense where you say, well, I mean, it is a preference of symmetry. I think CJ would say, well, I mean, God created it with that symmetry. So I think he would say, well, we don't want to run from saying, well, there's the symmetry, there's the structure. I mean, he even alluded to the literary framework. The Gospels do this throughout, right? Which drives some fundamentalist batty, because the chronology of the Gospels is all kinds of screwy if you try to read them all as straight chronological. They're somewhat synchronic, but they do that because they have certain thematic reasons for certain thematic symmetry that they want to drive, right? Or certain narratival reasons that they want to cluster certain things together, right? So the Sermon on the Mount is probably actually a cluster of multiple sermons together, but they follow the same type of theme, right? So you have some of that happens. So I think that's entirely possible that it's a preference for symmetry. The question that I think that would divide CJ and I is whether that preference for symmetry is on the authorship of the text as a literary structure, or if God has that preference for symmetry in his creation, and that's just reflected in the literature. So.
Thanks for that response, Tyler. And good question, One Way. I appreciate it. CJ, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that I would say that there is obviously, and I do agree with what you represented as my view there, as far as like thinking that God put the symmetry there intentionally. I'll say for me, symmetry, not only in stuff like this, but just in nature generally, has always been a big reason why I think God exists, period. Because it does seem to me like certain things are a little bit too structured, like somebody wrote this in a book somewhere, you know what I mean? And I do think that because of that, I'm not necessarily opposed to having any of those in the text, at all. So like, for example, in the case of the creation narrative we have in Genesis 1, there's a very clear structure of 1 couples with 4, 2 couples with 5, 3 couples with 6, and then the holy day is your +1, right? And it's clear as day. Once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. You know what I mean? The question then becomes, okay, is that because God is an intelligent being, a structured being, a being who likes symmetry, or is that just, the way that human beings tend to be? In a way, I almost think that it's kind of one and the same question if we are made in the image of God, but that's an open question in and of itself that people will debate until they're blue in the face. But, the point just kind of being that I think things like heptadic structures and stuff like that are not only found in the text, but they're found in creation. And I think as a fundamentalist, I wouldn't run away from that at all.
I appreciate it, CJ. Great responses from the both of you. Actually, Tyler, this was your question. So if you wanted to have a final word on that, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I actually think that this is probably one of the more interesting things when we're doing apologetics or theology. And that is kind of what is the direction between creation and the text, or between creation and the aspects of the human realm. So for example, the creation text is clearly a temple. That doesn't mean that it's not created in 6 days, but it's clearly a temple. You have outer courts, inner courts, holy of holies, right? You have Adam as a priest, to avad and to keep. You have all these same structures. Now the question is, the tabernacle and the temple, are those mirrored after the garden temple, or is the garden temple arranged that way to drive people to worship at the temple and the tabernacle, and then ultimately in Christ? So it's kind of the question is, where does that causal error go? And I think sometimes the causal error is both ways. I think there's sometimes a little like loop that happens. So and there's all kinds of these. There's a really, really, really good book by J.V. Fezco called Last Things First, which I recommend to anybody who's interested, because it basically argues that eschatology starts at the very beginning, and it has all these thematical, these themes that develop all the way through from the beginning to the end, and from the end to the beginning. So, it's a fantastic book for anyone interested in this very question.
I'm loving these thorough answers, guys. Great job. I appreciate it. Some great questions as well. So this one, now we got one for you, CJ. So like I said, we got a good mix of questions for the both of you. So this one comes in from Lena. And she says, CJ believes that it is a chronological order, but it is not really chronological. It is hierarchical. Genesis describes concentric spheres of being at the center of which is the man. I guess, what are your thoughts? How would you like to respond to that, CJ?
I would just simply say, with respect, not possible. It's literally not possible. It's very clearly a chronologically laid out text. It goes, literally verse 5, and there's other verses like this, of course, or chapter 5, starts out saying, and these are the generations of, right? Like, it's literally counting, and this person, and then went to this person, and then it went to this person, and then it went to this person. And of course, what was happening before that, you had this event, which was preceded by this event, which is preceded by this event, and so on and so forth, right? So I think this is very clearly a chronological, linear time-based order. The question is just whether or not that's literal, really, in my opinion, right? It's not whether or not that's the case, it's whether or not that's a literal fact. But that's kind of what I would say.
Thanks for that answer, CJ. Tyler, anything you wanted to add?
I think I'm going to disagree with the questioner and with CJ on this one. And that is, if you mean the book of Genesis, then there does seem to be a chronological order. It's not like the book of Revelation where you have kind of the cyclical model going throughout. Even if you have in Genesis, you have like chiastic structures inside of chiastic structures. I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, the author of Genesis is brilliant to actually structure it the way that they structure it, right? So you have that. What I would say, though, is that doesn't necessarily mean that any specific passage itself is in chronological order, right? So I don't think we can go just because Genesis follows a type of chronology throughout, a broad chronology, that therefore Genesis 1 has to be this kind of tight chronology, right? I think that it's actually somewhat synchronic, following, it takes the 7 calendar days, which is kind of to follow Klein. You kind of have upper register, lower register times, right? So you have this kind of loose chronology in the theme, but it does so kind of synchronic chronologically because day 4 is actually the same as day 1. Like it's bouncing back. It's not actually, this happened and all that kind of stuff. There's narratival movement, but it's not necessarily chronological.
I appreciate that, Tyler. CJ, question was for you, if you want to have the last word there.
Yeah, well, I guess so. If we wanted to separate, I'll just briefly address the one versus the rest, right? Because if we did want to say Genesis itself is chronologically ordered, but that doesn't necessarily mean Genesis 1, that is a fair point, in that I didn't demonstrate anything with Genesis 1, right? I kind of looked at the whole text itself. But there I would say it appears to me to be the same general thing. And it's interesting. I think to an extent, I think you actually agree with me on this, in that the calendar week is used in a chronological and numbered format. We're going from day 1, and day 2 does seem to be succeeding day 1, and so on and so forth. But again, it does seem to be like the question is more the intention of the author more than the communication per se of what we actually have here. And so in that sense, I would say it's a little bit of begging the question, right? Because that's sort of what the debate is about. But I guess I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that was also chronologically ordered, right?
Thank you for that, CJ. So this one now comes in for you, Tyler. This comes in from Truth Defenders. I appreciate the question. He says, question for Tyler. If Genesis was not literal, then was the fall? Is your view of original sin affected, which then follows? How do you view imputation? Adam to us to Christ.
Yeah, I don't know who Chris is, but no. Yeah, so I don't think. Can you put the question back? Oh yeah,
yeah. I was just going to that. There you
go. So literal is a weird word, and it depends on who you talk to, what they mean. In some sense, I do take the literal reading of the passage. I just think the literal reading is the sensus literalis, which is a temple text, right? So what I don't take is a chronological, literalism, and even that's different than like a wooden literalism. So it really depends on what you mean by the term. I'm trying to think. It's not Bruce Metzger. I'm trying to think of I have his podcast. I'm totally blanking on his name. Bill Mounts has a YouTube channel where he basically spends like 8 episodes why talking about literal when reading the Bible is just a terrible idea, because we all mean all kinds of crazy things by it sometimes. So with that said, let me ask the important part of the question, which is that I think what we see literarily is there's actually kind of an unwinding of the literary structure as you go through the text of Genesis. That's why you actually see distinction between Genesis 1 and then 2 through 3. And then you actually see in the primeval history, and then you narrow into to Abraham. You actually see these very interesting almost genre style shifts, like nuance shifts between all of them. However, that doesn't mean that I don't think Adam was a historical person. And so I think Adam was a historical person. I don't think he's an allegory for the human race or the human condition or anything like that. So it's in the same way that I could read the book of Revelation as being synchronic and in lots of ways highly stylized, highly symbolic, but it doesn't mean that I think that it's not talking about concrete historical things. So
I appreciate that answer to a good question from Truth Defenders. CJ, I'm not sure if you were there to hear any of that, or if there's anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, I was actually here the whole time. I was just kind of not on the camera itself, so I had that off. But I will say a couple things without disregarding anything that Tyler just said, because you can't, right? You have to take the positions honestly. I will admit Truth Defenders' question is one of my great fears about Tyler's position. And I say that while actively acknowledging what you just said, right? Because I don't want to like straw man you or misrepresent you or anything like that. Just because you want to say Genesis 1 means something doesn't mean that Genesis 2 automatically also means that something, right? And in fact, that would even be dangerous, because like we already established earlier, Exodus 15 it's certainly in the same narrative as the rest of Exodus, but it's not like you can just take that as the same way you took 14 and 16, right? So granting a lot of that, right? That said, the reason I think this is something that I am, shall we say, fearful of is because it seems to me like regardless of what the intention of somebody might be, and this is one of the issues I even had, and even initially before like we ever had this conversation talking about people like John Walton and Temple Text and stuff like that, which like I've said earlier, I even kind of largely agree with now. But one of my initial fears with it was, regardless of what Dr. Walton's intention is, this is like, kicked door open, modern science. You know what I mean? And I don't like that at all. And it's very coincidental. Sometimes it's literally coincidental, but it is still nonetheless coincidental that we happen to have that same thing happen when, we're in a world where everybody's saying that particular thing can't be true. Right. And just to give like an example of it, when people say, oh, well, there's this different natural phenomenon like the Theia eruption or something like that caused the Exodus. It's like, well, it's awfully convenient that you found this natural reason for these at the same time that we're starting to disbelieve that miracles happen. You know what I mean? If somebody said this 1,000 years ago when everybody believed in ghosts and zombies, then that would obviously be a little bit different of an argument. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that the view is wrong. It just means that these are concerns I have. Right. And I want to be clear with it that it is just concerns, right? Because you can be concerned about things that are, in fact, very often there's the philosophers have talked in the past about being concerned with truths, right? Should people know truths if those truths will cause somewhat of a negative? I obviously think that the truth is in the end the best thing. So if there is something that's true, we should know it, regardless of if it's going to cause some kind of a problem. But, this is a question goes all the way back to ancient Greece, where people would be scared not just of ideas, but things which were known facts, because known facts could cause people to act in a certain way. That certain way could be dangerous to society as a whole. And so, the point is, it's a fear of mine.
Thank you for that, CJ. Tyler, final points on that question?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said about slippery slope arguments, and that's fine. They're not always fallacious, so I get it. And look, I mean, there's a certain point where this was the same argument of the geocentrists, right? The heliocentrists are kicking open the door to secular science to come in, right? I mean, it's a similar type of argument. Doesn't mean it's always unmerited, right? There's a certain sense where a lot of critical scholarship, even if innocuous on the front, has kicked open the door, and we're seeing some of the outworkings of that, and that's fine. However, I think that in this case, I'm still convinced of a literal historical Adam, a singular Adam that was the progenitor of the human race. However, I'm also aware that there are several other views that would be entirely, in harmony, even with Reformed covenant theology, right? So you could have things where Adam was the first right? Maybe not the first humanoid, first human that God placed the image on and were related in covenant with, such that when Adam fell, you get all the exact same outworkings, right? So there is a certain sense where I'm going to say, yes, we need to be aware of where this is going, and not where it's going, where it could potentially go. But that's not to say that it necessarily means that if Adam was not the first and ever only human ever, that therefore Christian theology is going to fall apart, right? I think that Christian theology is far more robust and resilient than that. And I think that there have been some other views poised. I think the issue would come is if the movement was towards an allegorical reading rather than away from a historical Adam reading. It's just there's multiple ways that you can understand the historical Adam, right? If you move to an allegorical approach where Adam is just kind of a stand-in for all humanity, the human condition, yes, I think you have major problems.
I appreciate that answer, Tyler. Great points from the both of you, CJ and Tyler. So this one comes in from Praise I Am. This is for you, Tyler. This is a gap-related question, it looks like. So he asks, is Hebrew grammatarians have noted, or I'm guessing he says, as they have noted, the perfect aspect with the imperfect verb in Genesis 1:2 denotes a gap/break. Why is it that you don't align with them?
I mean, I'd have to look into it, because if I remember, and I'm looking at it right now, the Hayatah is it's a weird question to ask the perfect with the imperfect, because that's two verb tenses, right? So it's a kal verb of the perfect. So if they could give sources, that would be helpful. I'm not sure what it means to say a perfect with a perfect aspect with an imperfect verb. Because that would be like saying that it's an active verb with an imperfect verb. Like within one verb, that just I don't know what that means. So if they mean kal, which is typically identified as a simple past action with the perfect tense, then in that case, there is in some sense a conceptual break that it had been completed in the past, and now we're moving on narratively to a new action, and so you do have that break, but it's not necessarily a temporal break. And if that's what they mean, then I think that would be my answer. But I'm not exactly sure what they mean in that perfect imperfect combination. I mean, CJ, you studied Hebrew, I think more than I have. I just have 1 year, but I don't know if you understand this a little bit better.
Yeah, feel free to jump in, CJ. I know all three of us would not be gap theorists, so go ahead, CJ.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a couple things, just so you know, it's also about a year. I could potentially, the only time I ever have found myself having an advantage over other people learning Hebrew at the same time as me is that I'm also learning it conversationally. So it's not just biblical, you know what I mean? But whether or not that actually provides an advantage, who knows, right? On to the question. So in my obviously not expert opinion, as was just demonstrated, I think any Hebrew grammatarian who said there was a gap in Genesis 1:2 would be probably laughed out of most Hebrew schools. The overwhelming majority of Hebrew scholars don't say that. the overwhelming majority of the rabbis don't say. In fact, I'm fairly certain the gap theory doesn't exist in the rabbis, all of whom knew biblical Hebrew, of course, because they were, Hebrews in the Bible era. Not to be, too, like, I guess, rude to any modern people, because I know that people put a lot of work into this stuff, right? I'm not trying to just laugh them out or anything like that. But if the people who spoke the language in the time that it was being spoken didn't come to this conclusion, there's absolutely no reason why some guy trying to reconstruct the language 2,000 years later should get it.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, in my research, I've read almost every exegetical and academic commentary on Genesis, from the last 100 years. And again, I don't have them all memorized, and someone could have said something in offhand comments that I don't remember. I can't think of a single commentary that would argue that. So I could totally be wrong, and I could be remembering wrong. I read all the commentaries about 4 years ago, so there could be some of those comments in there that I missed. If this person has some, please reach out to me. Let me know if there's certain articles. That'd be great, but not that I remember.
I appreciate it, gentlemen. Why don't we do this, because I want to respect both of your time, and it is getting late, and we just crossed the 2-hour mark. Again, it's been a really sophisticated, just a fantastic discussion. I've had a ton of fun listening to you guys. So why don't we kind of wind it down with one final question here, and it's a question for both. So we can get both of your input on this one, and then we'll kind of call it a night. 2 hours has flown by, and you guys have made for a real fantastic discussion. I appreciate it. So this one comes in from Andrew Cumming. Question for both. Some theologians claim the light at the beginning refers to the Big Bang. What are your feelings on this? In brackets, he puts non-scientific wise.
Well, so let me say a couple things. The first thing, I'm not necessarily as opposed to the idea of a Big Bang as other YEC. I don't think it really matters how God decided to create it, because that's not the point of being YEC. Now, I don't know anything about the science behind Big Bang, so if my YEC brethren think that I am ignorant in saying that, then by all means correct me. But I've never found issue with the Big Bang from a younger perspective. That being said, I don't think I buy this. First off, I don't know that the Big Bang would have light, because the idea that it's a bang is not accurate. It's more like an expansion. It is a rapid expansion, but it's not like an explosion in the sense that you have like kindling in a fire and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So I don't know that you would get any light per se from a Big Bang, because it just sounds to me like you're thinking of like an explosion, like an actual explosion. And my understanding of the scientific Big Bang is that that's not what it is. Again, could just be ignorant on that, but that just seems like, not true. The other thing there would be that I don't know why, like, what would cause that light to be there but not stay there in the form of something else, right? Because most people typically say something like, either like what I just said, there is some other source of light, or maybe there's like a certain level of light that we just have to stay at. A lot of people will say things like that God is the light, but nobody ever says that there's like this light that's like created by the force of the bang itself. And so I guess I don't know. Maybe I'm just not understanding. But
no worries. I appreciate that answer, and I appreciate the question, Andrew. Tyler, what are your thoughts on that question?
I'll try to keep this brief, but coming from a non-concordist position, I don't think it's in any way possible that the Big Bang is even remotely in the mind of Moses or the Mosaic community to be writing that. I think reading this as a polemical temple text, what it's actually doing is within the Egyptian context of the Exodus, what it's doing is saying, okay, well, Pharaoh is the incarnation of Ra, the sun god, the light, the god of light, the one who casts the light on all creation and so on and so forth. There's a very, very clear polemical that light is not a magical god in creation. It is just luminaries. God has created them. They are just static things. For them, it's in the waters above the firmament, because they literally thought it was a molten dome with holding back waters. But it's very, very clearly a polemical saying, these lights, you think that it's Pharaoh? You think that it's Ra? No. God is the one that created. God's the one he didn't have to work. It's not a battle, all the kind of stuff. God just spoke and there was light. And this thing is what governs your days and your nights. And God is the one that's reigning and ruling over all of that. And so I think that's a much more faithful way to understand how these ancient Near Eastern Semites coming out of the Egyptian context would have understood the passage rather than a scientific theory about the Big Bang. So
I appreciate the answers from the both of you. Thank you for the question, Andrew. Thanks to everybody in the chat for some great questions and comments. Again, it's been a really, really awesome debate. I've really enjoyed myself here. Very easy to moderate, as it really was just an informal discussion. So you guys did a great job. Again, I want to thank you both for your time. And why don't we have some final words, final thoughts before we completely wrap it up here? We can start with you, Tyler. Again, thank you so much for being here and doing this great debate. Some final words?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would say is I'm very aware that a position like what I'm advocating here is different than what is normal in these discussions, and it challenges us to think about the Genesis passage and really about Scripture itself. It challenges us to think about how we read it and how we understand, and are we being faithful to what the original author, inspired by God, would have meant for his original audience. Yes, there is a sense where the Scripture is timeless. It is for all of God's people. But there's a concrete sense where there is an authorial intent meant for their audience, and we should try to understand that. And so sometimes that can be very uncomfortable. Sometimes it can take study. I've had someone say that I was a Gnostic because I'm saying that there's secret knowledge that you have to study to under. No, I mean, there is a certain sense where we understand all the Scripture. There's perspicuous Scripture. It's clear to my 6-year-old about who Jesus Christ is, why he came, the story of creation, fall, redemption, and the eternal state. I mean, there's perspicuity throughout, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to do the hard work of studying and trying to understand these passages as God would have inspired the original author to their original audience. And so I think that's hopefully what I've done here today.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Tyler. I appreciate those final thoughts and final words. And why don't we hand it over to CJ? Again, thanks to you as well. Some final points, final words you wanted to make, CJ?
Yeah, absolutely. And first off, I just want to say thank you, of course, to SFT audience and Mr. Vela for having this conversation with me. I think it was definitely a good and fruitful conversation. I'm going to go ahead and drop the Proverbs 27 quotes I like to drop at the end of every debate. So Proverbs 27:2 says, "Let another man praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips." So if you guys think that today I did an absolutely smashing job, please say so yourselves. Proverbs 27 also says in verse 17 that as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. So if I just completely face planted into the toilet today, also please let me know. And anything in between is free game as well. The only way that we get better at this is if we are actually having these kinds of talks. And by the way, when I say get better at this, I don't just mean in the sense that we're, I want to do this as a career. So of course I'd like to be a talented debater, but that's not really what I mean. I really mean, let's get to the truth. Let's edify each other because we are believers in Christ. And even when we're not talking to other fellow believers in Christ, we are trying to win people over to Christ. Right. And so that really is the point. Be ready always, for an apologia is not meant to make you look smart. So, it's meant to prove the gospel to the non-believers. So I think when Proverbs 27 says those things, it's not simply because of the fact that that's just the better way to improve yourself, but it is actually, edifying for us to get those kinds of responses from outside. So with that being said, if any of you guys are interested, the Synagogue is my channel. Very much would appreciate having you guys show up there. We're just crossed over 700 subscribers in December, so that was nice. And that's due to a lot of you guys here in the audience, and especially USFT. So thank you guys very much. God bless. This was a great conversation.
God bless. My privilege. Again, if you guys want to see more from Tyler and CJ, check the description box as I have them linked there, their websites and channels. Also, we will have both of them back here in the next couple months. CJ, I know we're working on some final details for you in terms of a thesis for your next debate. And then we've also got Tyler joining us for the Romans 9 discussion with A.K. Richardson at the end of the month, as well as a discussion with Joshua Gibbs. And before we shut it down completely, in case anybody is wondering, we have moved the debate between Chris Dade and Dr. Shabir Ali. Does the NT teach that Jesus is God? That will be the first week of next month. So time flies by, and this debate will be here in no time. So that being said, again, thank you so much to Tyler and CJ. Thank you to the audience. Thank you so much for tuning in, and God bless. Standing for Truth is out.